Hello, Kepler families. Welcome to another live with one of our teachers. Today we have Andy Eads, who's teaching photography for art and commerce this coming fall. Welcome, Andy. Glad to have you here.
And it's really good to be here.
So you're offering this course, and I think it's so interesting that you have for art and commerce up right away, just laying it out there. But before we dive into the course, I would love to hear about. So you're a career photographer, is that right?
That's correct.
And an industrial photographer was the phrase I read, and that in itself kind of caught my attention. What's an industrial photographer, and what have you been doing with photography?
An industrial photographer is a person who specializes in photographing things that relate to machines, to physical plants, to experimentation, scientific experimentation. And there's a smattering of portraiture in there and event photography and such as that. I'm a son of an engineer, and so I grew up around big machines. I worked at a steel mill for a summer. I was in the Air Force for 4 years and saw 4 Phantoms taking off. And I just love big machines and the science of things. Also, too, at about age 8, I was alongside my dad as he installed a home-built enlarger in the kitchen, and we started making prints. And I think I was hooked from that moment on. I miss my darkroom intensely, but I've managed to learn how to make digital work in some pretty neat ways. And I lack for no good things in terms of taking pictures that way.
Yeah, and I saw that actually your bachelor's, your degree is in industrial photography. Is that still a thing? Is that a major that still exists?
The school went belly up a couple of years ago, unfortunately. It was regarded as one of the 3 best in the country. And one of the things that has happened is that there aren't very many in-house industrial photographers. My first 20 years in the career were spent working for a large nuclear facility, Hanford site here in eastern Washington. And so they had in-house photographers because of clearances, because of the gigantic size of the facility, 540 square miles. It took an hour from where my photo lab was to get to the far corner of the site, driving at 50 miles an hour. So to give you an idea, it's a big place.
Wow.
And so, you know, with those kinds of constraints, they had an in-house photo department. However, with the advent of autofocus cameras and auto exposure, they started passing a lot of those duties off to the engineers and the scientists and the technicians who are out in the field right there with the stuff. So they wouldn't have to pay a photographer to come out and photograph a broken bolt or a construction progress. What they lost in that was the specialization that we bring to it, and that is that we can make rusty pipes look very attractive, or vice versa. We can make them look very dangerous. I recall one of my first assignments was that they had an old decrepit World War II vintage building that they were trying to do serious engineering out of, and the floors were shaking. It wasn't very sturdy. So the fellow who commissioned the photography said, would you come in here and make this place look as dangerous and as nasty as possible? I thought, I trained and worked my tail off learning to do photography, and you're asking me to make it look bad. But I applied all my skills, and he got the $3 million he needed to build the new facility. So I considered that a success.
Yeah.
But you know, you never can tell. Frequently, we would have high-level visitors, such as the Secretary of the Department of Energy, come for an inspection tour. And so we were photographing high-level political figures, visiting congressmen and senators, local business people. So we could be called on to photograph a visiting dignitary and then be crawling around the bottom of a reactor that afternoon. So
Huh.
it was a very varied place. We're also home to some of the people out there might know of it. It's a Battelle Memorial Institute operates a laboratory at the Hanford site, and they do a tremendous amount of research and development at even the molecular level. They're very, very detailed. And we would frequently photograph for those folks. So I was doing photographs of the geese and the egrets and the eagles and the lizards and the bugs and flora and fauna out here. And those were the assignments we loved the most because we get to go out with a PhD scientist, and all you had to do is ask them a couple of questions, and you would get these incredible lectures on the magnificent structure of God's creation out there at the site.
Huh.
I told you 540 square miles, only 5% of it is occupied. The rest of it has been pristine since before World War II. That makes it an incredible resource for ecological studies. So that's where the excitement for me comes from in doing this kind of photography.
Huh.
Wide variety, and it got my fingers into all sorts of things I might not ever have seen or done before. And so bring that around to why I'm excited about this class is that I have, I think, quite a bit of experience and quite a bit to offer regarding photography, how it's applied, who uses it, the power to shape opinion, the power to present facts and informational things. I took a lot of pictures that only an engineer would love,
Mm-hmm.
but they loved them because it gave them what they needed to prove their point or to demonstrate what was going to happen if you had these conditions. The scientific method,
Right.
but recorded photographically, and so that was a powerful thing. So I believe that I come to this offering both the aesthetic side of photography and a very practical commercial based side of it.
So let's talk about that combination, because I would like to come back around a little later in our conversation and visit the job potential that exists for young men and women. But let's talk about that art and commerce in your class title. And we've been talking about your career, so there's been a little more towards the commerce. But yeah, art and commerce. What does that look like?
Well, you need to understand the fundamentals of photography to make a decent photograph, no matter what you're trying to photograph. So I have a lot in common with a videographer who's trying to light a scene. I know what it's like to get the background light and get everything balanced and get the color quality of the light set correctly. So there's a lot going on there. So the art of it will involve the composition. The theme of my first course is to tell a better story. And I have a little mantra for the kids, so I'm going to give away a lesson here. What's my subject? What's my message? How are we going to frame it or compose it? Where's the light? What are my camera settings? Take the picture now and repeat until you can't figure any variations to make on it. So that idea of having a structured way of approaching a subject in a way that will convey information and tell your story applies either to art or commerce, or history or documentation. It all plays in all together.
Yeah, I think this would have been a question at any point in the history of photography, but now with the advent of just easy video, how does a still tell a story?
Oh, I think there's a magic to still photography. First off, there's a level of detail, even in spite of having 4K and 8K video these days. It's moving. And your purposes and goals in shooting a video of anything is to show the action that's going on. How will the people interact, or the animal jumping across the river, biting the alligator on the neck, whatever it might be. You're conveying things in time. A still photograph allows you to stop and study. And even you can go back to, photographs taken at the turn of the century, even in the late 1860s. They had it figured out. There were photographs made on 11 by 14-inch glass plates. And the contact prints of those things are so rich and full of detail. They call them pixel peepers now, but you can get out your magnifying glass, get in close, and see the incredible detail that they were able to capture. It is as informative. Oh, and the tonalities and the composition and things. Why do people still paint or draw or make a sculpture? It's those are all static objects, and yet they can cause us to well up with emotion, or these powerful feelings that here is captured for a moment God's creation for us. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing to do.
Well, you're going to get a big amen from me, because my wife is actually offering a drawing course and then a studio art course this fall at Kepler. So
very good.
Yeah, absolutely. And my father was an enthusiastic amateur photographer, was published several times. I actually remember it was one of the great tragedies of my childhood when all of his equipment was stolen. He was a doctoral student in Massachusetts in the 80s. And so his equipment was a couple of big cases. And it was stolen, and it broke his heart. He stopped photographing. It was a constant part of his life. After the equipment was stolen, he stopped for probably 15 years. But when he went back into it, he drove back in wholeheartedly. Of course, by the time he got to that point, a lot of things were digital, and he went digital. I saw that one of your publications for the Department of Energy was about the transition to digital. Early on in the conversation, you talked about your dark room and missing your dark room. What was that like? And is I guess negative photography, is that more than a niche hobby thing these days?
There are a few, but very few professionals that still shoot film. It has gone digital for obvious economic reasons. Even back in the early days when a digital camera and computer setup would set you back $60,000, it made sense for a busy commercial photographer because they were spending that much for film and processing. Okay. It also meant too that you could take the picture, get approval, strike the set, and be ready to take your next picture instead of having to wait for the processing cycle. It didn't take very long for the commercial photographers to figure out, if I can get a return on investment in 1 year on any piece of equipment that I own, it's worth doing. And so even though the resolution was poor at that time, we didn't have color management standards and so on, the handwriting was on the wall. And the early adopters were the ones that succeeded well.
So speaking of succeeding well, let's talk about the potential for photography as a career or as a great side hustle. I hope you don't mind talking about that.
No.
But yeah, so how could young men and women who are, of course, interested in the artistic side, but what about the commercial side? What are my prospects? How does photography play out in the job market?
Okay. I just figured out that I introduced myself to 150 classes as a teacher. And I told every one of them that the chance of becoming a commercial photographer as a full-time career, as a lifetime career, is about 1 in 400. So of the students that I had there, about once every 2 years, I would have a student who went on to pursue photography as a career. Okay, so there's lots of other careers where those numbers are much higher. However, as an adjunct, I would ask kids, and I'll do this with my course here too, is if you were a beauty stylist, would you like to have photographs of before and afters of the hair you've done to make somebody look really nice? If you're an auto body guy, would you like to have a photograph showing the beautiful paint job you did on that restored Model T or whatever. If you're a civil engineer, wouldn't you like to have good quality photographs of the project that you brought in under budget, not under a schedule? There are a bazillion different ways that photography can be used as an adjunct to careers of all sorts. And in addition to that, photography is fun. It is a great hobby. I retired from full-time teaching 2 years ago, and kind of rediscovered my love for grabbing a camera, throwing it over my shoulder, and heading down to the river to see if I could find an eagle or the pelicans or something like that. And so the joy of just finding something, using the camera to help you start discovering, your corner of the earth, is a powerful thing. So commercial wise, people can make a living at it. The ones who love it, they will be driven. They will find their way and make a living at it. Now, you mentioned the idea of a side hustle. I will freely admit that even as a full-time photographer working for the Department of Energy, I also photographed weddings. And I was the guy who would pick up the last-minute weddings. Normally they like you to schedule way ahead of time. And I'd get the shotgun weddings. I would get the ones where they decided they wanted to elope or whatever the reason was. It was short notice. And I was able to supplement the family income fairly well, just doing that as a side hustle. There are a number of women in my community here who do specialize in like baby and young children photography. Largely, they're women who are raising their own families. They're good at photography, and some of them have taken it to full-time work in the area here. So as a side hustle, it's possible to make a few bucks at it. As a hobby, it's a powerful, beautiful, wonderful thing to do. And as a career, it's a viable possibility still.
Yeah. Well, and I think about some of the folks I know who have done, baby photography, or even there's birth photography out there. A friend of our family does that, and wedding photography, and a lot of that is people who have a little bit, maybe they took a class in high school, like at Kepler, or just a lot of just study on their own, and they begin to practice. But I think about that kind of photography, and there's stuff that's very much pure, like design and just elements. I think that industrial photography, what you were talking about, is kind of on that end. And then you have the purely artistic photography. But it seems like so much of the applications of photography kind of marry utility of things with their beauty.
Indeed, they do. One of the things that I'm going to do in the class is by assigning an assignment. Let me give you a good example. Lines are a powerful portion of drawings and paintings and photography. I will ask the kids to go out and deliberately choose subjects that include lines, but to make them interesting. And we'll talk about how you frame things. I asked them to go on an ugly hunt and get rid of the junk in the picture and include only those things that are helping tell their story. And so by doing that, I'm probably, for most of those kids, going to be asking them to do something they wouldn't do on their own or not know to do on their own. I carefully structure this. The educational term is scaffolding, so that one skill builds upon the next. Or on the last rather, and each skill brings you to being a better photographer. So now some kids will gravitate to that lines assignment. Oftentimes, and they'll surprise you too, they'll find structures that are created by lines, a bridge or a trestle or something like that. Others will find a snake in the grass or a garden hose that looks like a snake. The whole idea, though, is the process of discovery. go out, look for these kinds of things, narrow your viewpoint down specifically to find those. And so that's how I marry up the technology of utilizing the camera with the aesthetics and asking the kids to expand their horizons a bit and look for things that they might not have considered before.
Yeah. Well, I like the idea that we might be able to count your class as a PE credit as well.
You rarely see a fat photographer, especially one that's working hard.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think about going out and having to take photographs for your class. What does a week look like for a student in your photography class?
What I like to do is give them a lecture, point them to a video, do a reading, or combination of all those things, to give them a grounding on where we're going to start and what the topic is, and then I'll give a lecture specifically on that subject. I'll do a demonstration so that they can see where you need to set the camera to actually make it happen relative to the subject. Or how to set the camera, where are the adjustments and things that you need to make happen for that. So do that live demonstration, then guided practice. Now that's something that I've got to figure out how to do online. It was easier to do in a classroom where I could, set them out in groups and then hover over them and see if they're doing things the way they need to and correct any mistakes at that point. But anyhow, guided practice, and then I set them out to actually go do the project. A complete assignment is going to include not just the pictures, but a rundown of what technical details. How is their camera actually set up? It made some decisions for you. You can go in and crack the code and have the camera tell you what it did, which builds up information about f-stops and shutter speeds and focal lengths and a whole pile of things, that they're buried inside those little black chips inside that camera. But we can get to that information, and it's important. So they'll do that technical rundown. Then I'll ask them to do a written portion on the assignment. Every assignment winds up with a written component. And they have to reflect on, what was the most difficult thing they had to do. Some of these assignments, it bends your mind with certain optical effects and depth of field effects and things like that. So some of the kids struggle at first because they're seeing results they weren't expecting. They might have had it right, but they had to struggle with it a little bit. And I never want to deny them that struggle. And then they have to tell me what they liked about the assignment. Were they satisfied with their picture? For the lines assignment, I'll ask them questions like, okay, what's guiding your eye around the photograph? Where does it start? Where does it end? Does your eye do a loop through this? Is there a continuous loop? So I'll ask them questions that relate to the aesthetics of that particular picture. And along those lines, also too, I want to emphasize for them ways to stir their own creativity. I mentioned the idea on the mantra: take the picture over again, try it from a different angle, try it from a different vantage point, higher or lower, try it with different lighting. Turn the subject around, photograph it from behind. The famous photographer Ansel Adams said, once you're done taking the beautiful picture in front of you, turn around and make sure you're not missing the one behind you. And I can't tell you the number of times I took that advice, and sure enough, there was something behind me that was worth photographing. So we'll be getting the kids, to do things. And then they have to submit the assignment as a package. And is it a good time to talk about grading?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I'm actually kind of curious.
Okay, so here's how it'll work. I've got a rubric that will, for each assignment, that lists out anywhere from 6 to 8 critical things that I want them to see, to have accomplished. So the first one's going to be, did you accomplish the end goal for this project? Did you photograph something with lines that either led to a subject or were the subject? And then, did you capture the camera information? Did you write the written work on this? Did you, whatever the other aspects of it were. Oh, and yeah, okay. So they either get an A or a not yet.
Okay.
Okay. So let's say the student forgot to put down the camera information. They've got a perfectly fine package otherwise, but they have a not yet. So the total grade for that assignment is not yet until they complete the camera data. They've got 5 days to get that done for me. Okay, 5 class days. If they turn it in within those 5 class days and that not yet changes into an A, then they have an A for the assignment. Now, the beauty of this is that I am not grading the kids in a comparative way. They have to meet a standard.
Mm-hmm.
So if, Susie has a picture of a cute cat and all the kids go, ooh, ah, isn't that a lovely picture? If it's not about lines, instead it's this fuzzy amorphous blob called a cat, they've missed the assignment. They need to go reshoot, start over again. But because it's a not yet, they'll have 5 days to do it. Okay. However, if at the end of 5 days they haven't reshot or made the correction, they only get the points that they earned up to that point in time. So if there were, say, 30 points out of 100 assigned to meeting the project, they only get 70%, and it stays that way forever. There's no getting out of that. If they don't turn in anything at all by the deadline, and there's no excused absences, they have 5 days to make it up. But if they miss a component on there, it'll be those points off. So, and there's also a 70% of penalty on this. You didn't hit the deadline. So, say you earned 70 out of 100 points times 70%, you got 49 points for that assignment. Deadlines matter in the world of photography, commercial photography especially. If you're the photographer who's photographing a basketball game, and the sports editor says, I must have those pictures in my hand by 11 p.m. I'm going to press it at midnight. And you show up at 11:30, you won't have a second assignment from that editor ever.
Right.
They can't trust you. They can't rely on you. And that has been my life in commercial photography from day one. Deadlines count. And so that's the grading practice here.
Yeah.
Everybody can get an A in my class, or some percentage of that if you got lazy somewhere down the line.
Yeah. Well, I kind of love that system because you're incorporating both the subjectivity and the objectivity in the world of photography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, it's a leadership skill, it's a business skill, it's a personal responsibility skill. And it's I think the way the course is structured, it's going to strengthen kids, and they'll have fun doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question from Daniel. So Daniel just dropped the comment that deadlines are indeed important because you can't miss the kiss if you're photographing a wedding. But he has a question about social media. Do you encourage students to have a platform for posting their photographs?
I haven't, largely because the good photographs would get stapled to the bulletin board outside my room, both to promote the class and for the kids to show off what they did. Yes, I would encourage that for the kids. I don't have that written into the lesson plans or curriculum just yet, but that's a good idea. I just might do that. Let me finish up there.
Yeah.
If this program takes off and I get the kids that are doing photo 3 and maybe even a photo 4, developing a portfolio that you can present online is going to be a critical assignment. So, in fact, I do that, but not with the beginners in the first semester.
Yeah. Well, and I think, honestly, you'll find that many of them post anyway. They might even post stuff that you wish they wouldn't quite yet. It's like, couldn't you wait until the next unit to start posting?
Oh, I can't restrict them for what they post. So,
yeah.
Now, what they submit for an assignment, I can have some control over.
Yeah.
But no, I would, that's part of the joy of photography is having an exhibition of your work, showing people, that you captured a moment in time that is very vital. And
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's I think about, I love taking pictures just with my cell phone and thinking about composition and that sort of thing, but I lack any sort of formal training. But just thinking about the photographers around me have taken real joy from that, and just a lot of the visual artists, honestly, because there is so much that stretches across all the visual arts where you have these touching points, and you can't necessarily execute in these other visual arts, but you can see what's been done. And I think that's actually, and I'd love to hear your interaction with this. To me, that seems like one of the really permanent values of a class like this, regardless of how much you continue in photography after graduation, but is this that eye that you've developed to now be able to interact aesthetically with things.
I used to meet in what was called a professional learning community with the other art teachers. Even though I was a career and technology teacher and should have been with the business people, I snuck out and went down and hung out with the art teachers. And yes, we developed common assessments. We developed an understanding about color theory. An artist has an idea of a color wheel that's different from a photographer. Photographers are driven by the eye sees with red, green, and blue sensors. The camera sees with red, green, and blue sensors. The color image you're looking at is produced with either cyan, magenta, yellow, the opponent colors, or red, green, and blue, the positive colors, and or I should say additive colors. And so our world is revolving around that. But I want my kids to know about the artist's color wheel, because that adopts the psychophysical aspects of what colors go together, what colors harmonize, which ones contrast with each other. And so, we came to a profound understanding that sharing how we're different, but how we're alike in what we're teaching was an adjunct to each other. And I've tried to fold those things into my curriculum as best I can. And I think it has enriched the program.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So, well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Andy. Thanks so much for being here and sharing some of your life experience in this upcoming course. There's another comment popping in, a lengthy one. So let's take a look at this. What do you think of composition in terms of the restrictions that various platforms enforce, like the 9:16 or 16:9? Would you say it's unfortunate or a constructive limiter like a nifty 50 lens?
Here's how I handle it when somebody forces a constraint on me like that. I shoot it the way I want it. It's my expression. It has to be formatted and framed and composed in the ratios that I want. Sometimes my pictures come up as squares, sometimes rectangles, sometimes panoramas. However, if I'm being constrained by something, I will insert my picture into the frame that they want me to live in, but it's going to be the picture surrounded by a neutral boundary. And so whether they like it or not, that's the way my picture is going to be framed. So there are ways around it. And, the artist ought to stick to his or her guns about how you express yourself.
I think a lot of social media platforms have figured out that people instinctively do push back. A lot of visual social media platforms start out kind of rigid, and then they loosen up when they realize people are they're reframing things so they can put it up in the accepted standard that they've set. And pretty soon you find that they're loosening things up because they want people to use their platform, and people want to express themselves the way they intended to in the first place.
Yeah.
Or sometimes even the way the object presents itself.
Yeah. I hope we got good answer for that one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if Daniel was satisfied. I certainly was.
Yeah. He made a comment. He takes pictures in multiple versions. That's a smart way to do things if you're a commercial photographer. You never know where they're going to put text. You never know how they're going to use it. where they're going to fly it in, things like that. That's a smart thing to do if you're a commercial photographer. And in the Photo 2 class, we'll get into just exactly that.
So, Daniel, I want to encourage you to take advantage of our lifelong learner program. So, adults are welcome to audit our courses, and we do have as well a lot of course offerings that are specifically for adults, and we'll be sharing some of those more publicly with everybody soon. So, so feel free to communicate with us. Daniel Fukushon is actually our CEO, but do feel free to communicate with us about our lifelong learner stuff, because I have the feeling that you're gonna try to get in on this class. Daniel is that'd be absolutely wonderful. Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And I'll look forward to talking to you again soon. Do feel free to stay on the line after we say goodbye, and we can chat a little bit afterwards. And see, we've got Daniel all excited about the course. So anyway, Andy, thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Glad to be here.